Time for a change of pace. Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife and today I am taking you through some of my favourite Irish non-fiction books and also some of the non-fiction books that I would love to read that were written by Irish authors. I don't read a whole lot of non-fiction. It might come up maybe like once or twice a month, but all of the non-fiction that I have read, all of the non-fiction that I've got my eye on is something that I'm really interested in. It's something that it's a subject that's really important to me, or it's an author that I've really loved and really respected, or it's a celebrity whose life I have followed. And this is also true of Irish authors. There are some completely different topics in here. There are some about taking care of your mental health, there are some biographies, there are some stories of Irish people of colour in here, but all of them are a fantastic read. First one on the list is the most recent non-fiction Irish book that I've read, and that is A State of Emergency by Richard Chambers. Richard is a news journalist working with Virgin Media, one of our really big TV companies back in Ireland. And this book is about his reporting on the coronavirus, on the very early days of COVID, on the very early days of the lockdown in Ireland, of how the lockdowns were set up by the government, of all of the things that had to close, all of the things that had to change, things that we would have gone through as people living in Ireland at the time of the virus. There are also a little bit more stories of hope. There are stories about the delivery of the vaccines to Ireland. There are stories about the first person to ever get the vaccine and coming back out of lockdown and how that was handled by the government. There are also some really harrowing and really heartbreaking true life stories in here. There is a story about a doctor who spent most of his life caring for people in the Mater Hospital in Dublin. His daughter also went into medicine and was looking forward to working beside her dad as a kind of father-daughter doctor duo. Unfortunately, while caring for patients with coronavirus, Dr. Saeed Wallah Aki actually lost his life to the virus itself. He spent about 3 months in intensive care in the hospital that he actually worked in, but his daughter Samar was employed by the Mater and now she gets to kind of continue on his legacy, which I thought was a really nice chapter at the end of the book to kind of bring you a little bit more hope into the future. This is such a great book, but it can bring on a little bit of COVID PTSD. It might be one that you need to read when you are completely removed from the situation, when you have stopped hearing about COVID deaths, when you've stopped hearing about COVID cases coming up every now and then. But if it's something that you can stomach, I definitely recommend this one. Ironically, because I just fluffed up my hair, the next book is Don't Touch My Hair by Emma Dabiri. Emma is a person of colour. She was born in Ireland, she grew up in Ireland, and her book is all about the discussion of being a black person in Ireland, of the idea of racism and how it can be still quite prevalent in Irish life. I haven't read this book yet. I have had it on my site for such a long time and I really do want to get to it because I know that a couple of people that have read a lot of non-fiction and a couple of people who have got kind of similar book tastes to me have really enjoyed this one. I know that Emma is at the moment living in London and I think she has got another book out or coming out that I also would really like to get my hands on. Next up is Did You Hear Mammy Died by Seamus O'Reilly, and this is Seamus's memoir of growing up as one of the youngest children of 11. He has 10 siblings. They all grew up in a small little town in Derry, and when he was 6 years old, his mother passed away from breast cancer. The title of the book comes from Seamus walking around at his mother's wake and telling everyone, "Did you hear Mammy died?" And that kind of sets the tone for this book. It is completely hilarious. It gives you kind of an insight as to living in a family with so many children and also living with their widowed father and how everything had impacted him and his relationships and his life. There's also a really nice chapter about Sally, one of the family dogs, and I absolutely broke down crying at this chapter. It's so wonderfully written and it is so poignant and heartbreaking but also really funny at the same time. That is pretty much how you can describe the whole book. Actually, it's quite poignant and it's quite heartbreaking and it's quite funny and it's quite entertaining all at the same time. And also it will make you really glad that maybe you don't have 11 children or maybe you don't have 10 siblings that you have to fight for the bathroom with, or that you never have the house to yourself because there's always somebody walking around the place. However, maybe it will also make you wish that your family was a little bit bigger. Next up is A Light That Never Goes Out by Keelan Shanley. Keelan was a presenter of the main news bulletin at 6 o'clock in Ireland, and she was diagnosed with breast cancer in around 2017, I think. This whole story is Keelan's life as a journalist, Keelan's life with her diagnosis, her journey with cancer, how her treatment went, and unfortunately Keelan did lose her life to cancer in about 2018-2019. I really liked her as a journalist, I really respected her as a journalist, and I really loved watching her on the 6-1 News. She was really joyful, she was really engaging, and listening to her book and reading the book and reading her story and hearing about her life as a journalist and also as a cancer patient, it really does bring it all into perspective. I listened to this around February or March of last year, and I really was encapsulated by this book. It is finished posthumously by her husband Connor, who gives a kind of an afterword into this book, and I really loved his insight into it too. Next up is Mindful by Dermot Whelan. Dermot Whelan is a radio presenter and a comedian in Ireland, and he suffers quite heavily from anxiety. He was at a comedy festival in Kilkenny one afternoon, and he had a massive panic attack where he was put into an ambulance and had to be hospitalised for it. After this, he really started to work on mindfulness. He really started to look into all of the ways that he could kind of control his anxiety himself by sitting down, by thinking about things, by kind of rationalising his thoughts. As somebody who also has quite a lot of anxiety, this book was such a help. He does have dotted throughout the book a couple of mindful exercises that you can try. He does have some kind of tips that you can use to reduce your anxiety or to rearrange how you're thinking about a specific situation you're in. And I really loved that. It's a book that I would like to get a personal copy of because I listen to the audiobook from my library back at home. I'd love to get a physical copy of it that I can flick through it, go back to the exercises that Dermot went through. He does walk you through them, and the audiobook itself is great because he audibly guides you through these meditations. It's definitely one that I would recommend for anybody who is suffering from anxiety or who just would like to rearrange their thinking a little bit. Staying with Mental Health Rep, and 2 books that I have not read yet, but I was recommended by a friend of mine, are Owning It and The Confidence Kit, both by Caroline Foran. Caroline has a podcast again about mindfulness, about anxiety, about rearranging your thoughts and how you're thinking about specific things. And one of my friends said that she thought that this would really help me out. Now, when said friend did tell me that, I went to book both books on my Kindle and then never went to read them. But I do know that I have them in my back pocket if my anxiety ever really starts to spike, or if I just would like something that's going to help me through it a little bit, and I don't have any of the normal crutches that I would rely on to. Caroline herself also does have quite a lot of anxiety, and while she's not a therapist and while she's not qualified, I do think that she would have a really great insight into how to reduce your anxiety and how to kind of rearrange your mindfulness and your thinking. Next up is probably one of the most famous Irish non-fiction books, and that is Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. Frank McCourt was born in New York, and he has 4 or 5 siblings. I think one of them didn't survive past infancy and then was brought back to Limerick, where his mother Angela had grown up. So this whole book then is about Frank's childhood, about him growing up in New York, about him growing up in Limerick as a 2nd-generation immigrant. I haven't read this book, and I know that it is so popular with so many people. I know there's so many people who have loved it. I know that it is a film starring Angelica Houston. I know that he has got a 2nd book called Tis, I think, which I think is another kind of an extension onto Angela's Ashes. It's one that I've said for years and years and years. I'm going to sit down and finally read it one day. It's just that that day doesn't seem to have come yet. Next up are a couple of books about the Irish language, which is a topic that is so close to my heart. I am a Gaeilgeoir. I have such a big interest in the Irish language. I feel like nowadays I don't get a lot of chances to talk about it, to speak it, to experience it. So anytime that I've got a book that is about the Irish language, I'm all in. First up is 32 Words for Field by Manchán Maingán. This book is all about the etymology of Irish place names, how we have come to give the names that we have given to the places where we grew up or the places that surround us. I also really like learning about etymology, about learning about the place names of everywhere in Ireland. There are so many kind of interesting translations around Ireland that I am really interested to pick this book up. I got it in a kind of a €2 sale in my local Easton's the last time that I was back at home. And the next time that I go back home, I think it's going to have to be the time to pick it up. Another book about the Irish language is Mother Folklore by Darach Ó Sé. I was given this book as a gift by my friend Caitlin, who said, no matter where you are in the world, always remember Ireland is home. And that was such a perfect little note to put into this book, because this book really does talk a lot about the concept of Irish as a language in a country where it's not really spoken very much. There are probably about 400,000 native Irish speakers or fluent Irish speakers in a country of about 5 million people. A lot of that is to do with how Irish is treated in the education system, about people's unwillingness to continue learning or experiencing the language. But reading this book really did make me want to give it another go. In the book, Darach talks about Irish names, about Irish place names, about how we have given words to the English language, such as smithereens, such as boreen. There's so much that I loved about this book. It's one that I'm going to dip into every now and then when I just want to have a little bit of a slice of home. And Darach's second book, Crack Baby, is all about his relationship with his newborn daughter. His daughter was born in between Mother Folklore and Crack Baby. So it is talking about how is he going to instill this love of the Irish language, and how is he going to instill this love of Irish culture on this brand new child that he is now responsible for. Next up is one more about Irish culture, and that is Tickling the English by Dara Ó Briain. Dara Ó Briain is one of my favourite Irish comedians, bar none. I love the man. I have loved him on Mock the Week. I have loved him on Taskmaster. I have loved him on any other show that he has made an appearance in. Tickling the English was written while he was touring one of his shows back in maybe 2007, 2008. Dara has lived in the UK for about 20 years, so he is kind of a good person to see what the cultural difference is like in Ireland and in the UK. His wife is English, his children were born in England to Irish and English parents, so a lot of this book is talking about the differences between English people and Irish people. And you might think that we might be closely related, you might think that we might be a little bit similar, but it does open up your eyes to some really interesting insights that you would have never thought we would have had. Next up is A Ghost in the Throat by Doireann Ní Ghríofa. Doireann is an Irish language activist, and I really loved reading this book about her rediscovering a woman in the 1700s who history had pretty much forgotten. Eileen Dubh Í Chonaill had written a poem about her husband, Artie Lera, after his death. This was kind of common back in the 1700s in Ireland when somebody had passed away and they were of great nobility. You would write a lament about them, memorising their life, telling about all of the things that they had done, all of the great things that they had accomplished, and saying what it was like to be without them. When Doireann found this, she went in and kind of discovered more about Eileen Dubh Í Chonaill and this woman that Irish history had forgotten. The story is also kind of dotted along the lines with Doireann's own story of pregnancy, a quite difficult birth, I would say, and a quite difficult adjustment period when it's a baby that she wasn't particularly expecting to have, and how she is finding that settling in with the children that she already has at the moment. I really loved this book. Again, it's got quite a lot of celebration of the Irish language, given that Doireann is a fluent Irish speaker, and I really, really loved this book. It's got such a great narrative style to it, and it's also really immersive in that you feel like you are also standing in the annals of UCC learning about this woman. Another book that kind of deals with pregnancy is Notes to Self by Emily Pine. Emily talks about her own pregnancy, about the pregnancy of her sister, about losing this pregnancy, and about the rainbow baby that comes. But also there's quite a lot of discussions of alcoholism. Emily's father is quite heavily alcohol dependent, and he has lived in Greece for about 20 years or so at the beginning of the book. And when he is hospitalized because of cirrhosis, I believe, everything kind of comes into the fray here, where you are dealing with a medical emergency in another country where you can barely speak the language. The impact of this medical emergency on the family and how it has completely shaped their lives and how it completely shaped their landscapes. I thought that this was such an interesting insight into alcoholism and how it can impact your family, but also such a really great discussion about pregnancy, about birth, about stillbirth, about pregnancy loss. And it's such a great book that I think everybody should read. Next up is An Seo by Una Mín Kavanagh. Una Mín was born in Vietnam and adopted by a woman from Kerry in 1990. And she's lived in Kerry for most of her life. She also lived in Dublin, and we actually went to the same university, but I don't think that our paths ever crossed. I don't remember ever meeting Una Mín. She talks about her life growing up with a single mother in Kerry. She talks about her life as a person of colour in Ireland and how she was seen by people as not fully Irish, as an outsider, and how the everyday racism that she encountered had completely changed her life. And also her draw for the Irish language and her intense bond with her grandfather, which is such a wonderful thing to have read. You could really see this beautiful relationship between Una Mean and her grandfather, and I absolutely loved reading about it. The final book that I'm going to recommend to you is Not Lost by Sarah Maria Griffin. You may know that name as the author for Other Words of Smoke, which is a phenomenal YA fantasy book. But also Sarah talks about her life living in San Francisco for 3 years. She worked as an au pair. She and her husband actually got married when they were in San Francisco. They eloped and they basically just went to the courthouse one day and then had their reception, I think, in Disneyland or something. And it just sounded so wonderful. But also there are some really great stories about being Irish in San Francisco, in a country where being Irish is almost seen as like a badge of respect. That American people are so welcoming to Irish people, they're so welcoming of Irish culture, but also the casual racism that she would maybe not have expected while she was living there. I don't remember if it was a story from this or if it was a story from a podcast that Sarah presents, but she was talking one time about being in San Francisco, standing in a vegetable market, and a man asking her if all she wanted was to buy potatoes, and her face just fell. And she didn't engage with the conversation anymore. And this is something that I think every Irish person will know and every Irish person will have experienced no matter where we go in the world. Those are some of my favourite Irish non-fiction books, and also some Irish non-fiction books that I would love to try out. Are there any of these books that you have already tried out, or is there one that you would love to pick up yourself? If you'd love to leave me a comment but you can't think of anything you'd like to say, then just leave me the magnifying glass emoji. Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.